You can support In the Past Lane by buying some of our merchandise. We've got merch with quotations from famous people in history, like George Orwell, who said, "The most effective way to destroy people is to deny and obliterate their own understanding of their history." And we've got some snarky ones, too, like one of our bestsellers that says, "Historians Against History Repeating Itself." And this one has many variations, like archivists against history repeating itself, also history majors, history teachers, A-push students, and more. You can get these designs and many more on everything from a t-shirt or a hoodie to a water bottle or a baby onesie. Just go to our website, inthepastlane.com, and click on Merchandise. Thanks.
We the people of the United States, in order to form a more
to
perfect
huddled
union,
masses yearning to breathe
Consider
free.
that we shall be as a city upon a hill.
that all men and women are created equal.
Give me liberty or give me death.
Nobody's free until everybody's free.
And the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
Hi there. Welcome to In the Past Lane, a podcast about American history and why it matters. Brought to you by SBI, Snoring Beagle International, and coming to you from the 15th Amendment Studios, located in central Massachusetts. I'm your host, historian at large, Edward T. O'Donnell, and this is episode 187. Every week here at In the Past Lane, I tell you what happened in U.S. history this week, with special attention to one important story. So what's happening in the Past Lane this week? Well, like millions of Americans, I'm getting used to social distancing and working from home. My wife and I are empty nesters, so we have the house to ourselves and our crazy little dog, a cockapoo named Luna. If you follow me on social media, you've likely seen a good many photos and videos of puppy Luna. My first week of teaching remotely went really well. I'm using Zoom, and my students did a great job of keeping up with the reading and participating in our discussions. Teaching remotely is a little awkward, but in some ways it stimulates more engagement from students. As one of my friends said on social media last week, when using Zoom, there are no seats in the back of the room. Anyway, I'm looking forward to week 2. I hope you and yours are doing well in this time of crisis. You don't need a historian to tell you that we are living in a historical time, one that will have a lasting impact in the coming decades. So be careful and be safe. All right, let's get on with it. Here's what happened in U.S. history this week. Let's start with this. On March 30th, 1870, 150 years ago this week, the U.S. Secretary of State, Hamilton Fish, certified that the required 3/4 of the states had ratified the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, and that it was now in effect. This was the third of 3 amendments added to the Constitution in the wake of the Civil War. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment defined U.S. citizenship, established voting rights for African Americans, and established the principle of equality before the law. The 15th Amendment was intended to strengthen the right of African Americans to vote. It read, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state, on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude." And that last part clearly a reference to slavery. For African Americans and their white Republican allies, the 15th Amendment was hailed as a key achievement in reshaping the U.S. political system into a multiracial democracy. As President Ulysses S. Grant put it, the 15th Amendment, quote, "completes the greatest civil change and constitutes the most important event that has occurred since the nation came to life." Grant and his fellow Republicans were right in celebrating the revolutionary nature of the amendment, but some of them expressed an unfounded and naive optimism about its ability to empower African Americans. They claimed that with the 14th and 15th Amendments in place, Black Americans no longer needed federal protection from vengeful white Southerners who bitterly resented the end of slavery and the onset of black freedom and equality. Representative James A. Garfield of Ohio, the Speaker of the House and a future president, said the 15th Amendment, quote, "confers upon the African race the care of its own destiny. It places their fortune in their own hands." The message was clear. African Americans now had everything they needed to succeed, and if they failed to secure their place in American life, then that was their own fault. Well, let's hold that thought for a moment. We'll circle back to it shortly. For now, let's consider what had already happened in the years leading up to the ratification of the 15th Amendment. First, African Americans had already gained the right to vote back in 1867, under a Civil Rights Act passed by Congress. And this right was then made permanent in 1868 under the 14th Amendment. From the start, formerly enslaved people seized this new freedom. Some 700,000 African Americans registered to vote, nearly all of them as members of the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, emancipation, and now civil rights. And the results were remarkable. More than 600 formerly enslaved men won seats in state legislatures and to other state and local offices. Still hundreds more served in all manner of posts, from Register of Deeds to Justice of the Peace. Some even went to Congress. Between 1869 and 1901, 22 African Americans would serve in the U.S. Congress, 20 in the House and 2 in the Senate. Let's just note one example. On December 12, 1870, Joseph Rainey, a man born into slavery in South Carolina in 1832, was sworn in as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. Think about it. A man who just a few years earlier was considered property and possessing no rights was now a citizen and a member of Congress. Historical change doesn't get more revolutionary than that. And that's why I always refer to this first half of Reconstruction, roughly 1865 to 1872, as the Reconstruction Revolution. The impact of this revolution in the South in the early years of Reconstruction was profound. Under Republican rule, Southern states enacted progressive legislation designed to improve the lives of average citizens. Most states, for example, significantly expanded public education, which had been woefully underfunded in the past. Many also passed laws to protect the civil rights of citizens and launched public works projects such as road building to boost economic growth. They also changed state tax codes to lessen taxes on the poor and middle classes and increase them on the wealthy. Not surprisingly, white Southern resistance to these changes was intense, as were efforts to undermine and thwart black political power. The most vivid form of this resistance were vigilante groups, like the Ku Klux Klan, that used violence and murder to oppress African Americans and their allies. This was the context in which the 15th Amendment was passed and ratified in 1870. It was a recognition by Congress that African American voting rights faced intense opposition. And Congress did something else in 1870 to protect black civil rights. It passed the first of several so-called force acts that compelled the federal government to use its power and authority to defeat groups like the KKK. And it worked. Within 2 years, the federal government succeeded in crushing these violent groups throughout the South. And so, as I always say at this point when talking about Reconstruction, if we stop the clock at this point, say roughly 1872, the Reconstruction Revolution had achieved unbelievable results. It had won for African Americans citizenship and full civil rights, including the right to vote. It had seen hundreds of thousands of African Americans vote for the first time, and many of them win election to public office. It had seen them join with white allies in the South to form an extraordinary and unprecedented experiment in interracial democracy. And it had seen that interracial coalition pass laws and adopt policies in Southern states designed to protect civil rights and expand opportunities for average citizens. But this exercise in stopping the clock is just that. It's an exercise that allows us to take stock of a historical situation. But history doesn't stop. It marches on. And march on it did during Reconstruction. And it was in these years after 1872 that saw many of the accomplishments of Reconstruction dismantled by a process that one might call the Reconstruction CounterRevolution. Here's what happened in a nutshell. The single most important thing that allowed the Reconstruction Revolution to occur was the use of federal authority to protect civil rights. So long as the federal government remained committed to upholding civil rights and democracy in the South, the achievements of Reconstruction would endure and grow. What happened, however, is that this commitment on the part of political officials in the North began to waver and eventually disappear after 1872. And it did so for several reasons. First, the Grant administration became ensnared in a series of scandals involving high-ranking officials, including members of Congress and cabinet officials. Second, the Panic of 1873 touched off 5 years of the most severe economic depression in U.S. history up to that time. And third, many political officials began to argue that the federal government had done enough for the formerly enslaved, and that it was time to remove the U.S. military from the South and leave African Americans to chart their own destiny. Now would be a good time to revisit that quote from James A. Garfield that we mentioned at the beginning of this piece. He said that the 15th Amendment, quote, confers upon the African race the care of its own destiny. It places their fortunes in their own hands. Well, the combination of these three factors created a climate in which it became very difficult for Northern politicians to justify a continued federal commitment to protecting the rights of African Americans in the South. As a result, after 1872, organized white resistance to Republican rule, both legal and illegal, began to rise. And it had two principal goals. First, to strip away African Americans' hard-won economic, social, and legal rights. And second, to prevent them from voting and holding office. Vigilante violence began to soar, and it reached full development in Mississippi in 1875, when armed groups of whites that were allied with the Democratic Party waged a carefully organized campaign of terrorism that came to be known as the Mississippi Plan. Through threats, beatings, and killings, they delivered an unambiguous message. Blacks and their white allies who dared vote Republican risked their lives and their livelihoods. Alarmed by these developments, the governor of Mississippi, a Republican named Adelbert Ames, called upon the Grant administration to send troops to keep the peace and to protect the polls. His request was rejected. Not surprisingly, more than 60,000 Mississippi voters, nearly all of them black and Republican, stayed away from the polls on Election Day. And here's a good example of how it worked. When 1,500 African Americans gathered to vote in Aberdeen, Mississippi, they were informed by a white mob that, quote, if they did not leave town within 5 minutes, the last man would be shot dead. Democrats swept to victory in Mississippi and took control of the state legislature for the first time since the Civil War. Immediately, they threatened Governor Ames with impeachment and forced him to resign. Well, the success of the Mississippi Plan in intimidating black voters and demolishing the base of the Republican Party inspired other southern states to employ their own version of it. And the political terrorism worked. One by one, the remaining Republican state governments fell to a new class of political leaders known as Redeemers. As this name suggests, they cast themselves in almost biblical terms as saviors of Southern society. Saviors from black and Republican rule, that is. As one African-American Republican named George Arnold put it, "It seems to me that we are drifting back under the leadership of the slaveholders. Our former masters are fast taking the reins of government." And we can see the success of this counter-revolution in the career of the aforementioned Joseph Rainey, the former slave turned congressman. Rainey served 4 terms in Congress and played an important role in the debates over Reconstruction. In 1876, however, as the Mississippi Plan and the Redeemer movement gained momentum, Rainey barely won re-election against his white Democratic opponent. 2 years later, in 1878, that same Democratic challenger defeated Rainey, ending his political career. This Reconstruction CounterRevolution was completed in the 1880s and 1890s as Southern state governments devised clever ways to undermine the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. They imposed segregation, and the United States Supreme Court allowed it. They also imposed all manner of things to deprive black citizens of the right to vote, things like the poll tax and literacy tests. By 1900, African American voting in the South had been nearly eliminated, and that would remain the case until the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. And here's a key takeaway from this story. Laws, even constitutional amendments, are only valuable insofar as they are enforced. Laws and amendments that are not enforced are not worth the paper they are printed on. Sadly, we see evidence of this fact in 2020, as many states in recent years have enacted laws and policies intended to diminish the ability of people, especially people of color, to vote. The 15th Amendment and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 say this is illegal and unconstitutional. But it's all about enforcement. That is certainly something to ponder on this, the 150th anniversary of the 15th Amendment. So what else happened this week in U.S. history? March 31st, 1776. Abigail Adams wrote her now famous letter to her husband, John Adams, urging him and members of the Continental Congress to, quote, remember the ladies, in the making of laws for a nation that seemed on the verge of declaring its independence from England. Women, she wrote in so many words, deserved liberty too. April 4th, 1967, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. delivered a speech titled, A Time to Break Silence, a speech against the Vietnam War. He said, a nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. King was vilified by many for this speech, including President Lyndon Johnson. Exactly 1 year later, on April 4th, 1968, King was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. April 5th, 1918, the first report was published that noted the rapid spread of a deadly strain of influenza in Haskell, Kansas. This was the first indication in the United States of what would come to be known as the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918-1919, one that killed 700,000 Americans and worldwide killed between 50 and 100 million people. And if you want to know more about this story, particularly as we hunker down in our own pandemic, check out In the Past Lane episode 105. And how about birthdays of some notable people? March 31st, 1927, labor leader Cesar Chavez. March 31st, 1875, heavyweight boxing champion Jack Johnson. April 2nd, 1875, automobile magnate Walter P. Chrysler. And April 4th, 1802, pioneering advocate for the humane treatment of the mentally ill, Dorothea Dix. Okay, time for the last word. Let's give it to Abigail Adams, who, 244 years ago this week, wrote to her husband John Adams, urging him to push for greater rights for women in the soon-to-be independent United States of America. I long to hear that you have declared an independency. And, by the way, in the new code of laws which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies, and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion, and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. Well, that's going to do it for In the Past Lane this week. You can learn more about me and everything we talked about at inthepastlane.com. And let's interact via social media. I'm at In the Past Lane on both Twitter and Instagram, and our Facebook page is In the Past Lane Podcast. See you next week.
SBI, Snoring Beagle International.